she heard the song on the radio for the first time. She had written every word of it. It was playing in the lobby of a hotel in Memphis, a Thursday in November, 1968. The radio behind the front desk turned up just high enough to be audible from the elevator bank across the room. Tina was crossing the lobby with a garment bag over one arm and a cup of coffee in her other hand. She was moving the way she always moved between obligations, efficiently, with her attention already 3 steps ahead of her body. Then she heard it. The melody hit her before the lyrics did. That was how she always recognized her own work, not through the words first, but through the specific pattern of intervals, the shape of the phrases, the particular quality of how one note moved to the next in a way that felt inevitable from the inside and looked effortless from the outside. She had a way of working in those years, humming late at night after rehearsals were done, finding things in the air that she later brought to whatever piano was available in whatever city they were in. She had found this melody about 6 months earlier in a practice room in St. Louis, past midnight, when the building was otherwise empty and the only sound was the occasional click of the heating system and her own voice feeling its way through something she didn't yet have words for. She had found the words over the following 2 weeks, in hotel rooms, on the tour bus, in the minutes before sound check when a piano was available and the schedule allowed 30 minutes that didn't belong to anyone specific. She had written the song on the back of set lists and in the margins of a pocket notebook she kept in her bag. She had filled 3 pages with different versions of the second verse before landing on the one that was right. She remembered the specific afternoon she had gotten the 3rd line, that small internal rhyme that tied the verse together and made it feel clean and inevitable once it was found. She had spent 40 minutes on that line alone, 14 variations tried in a rehearsal room in Nashville before arriving at the one that worked. She had hummed it to herself on the walk back to the hotel that night, quietly satisfied in the way that completion sometimes allows. Now it was playing on the radio behind the front desk of a hotel in Memphis, and the voice singing it was not her voice, and she stood in the middle of the lobby with a garment bag over her arm and a cup of coffee growing cold in her hand, and listened to her own 40 minutes rendered in someone else's instrument. She stood in that lobby for the full duration of 2 songs. The woman singing was good. Tina registered this with the precise, professional attention of someone who had spent years listening to how other people handled a melody. The voice was smooth, well-controlled, with warmth in the lower register that served the song's architecture. It was a good performance of a good song. If she had encountered it without knowing its history, she would have found it simply well-crafted, well-delivered, worth the listen. But she knew its history. And what she registered, standing in that lobby, was not the performance, but the arithmetic. She understood, without needing it explained, how a song traveled from handwriting in a pocket notebook to a studio session to a radio frequency. She understood the architecture of that kind of transfer, the broker who facilitates it, the paperwork that converts it, the copyright that arrives after the fact bearing a name that is not the name of the person who hummed the melody in an empty practice room at 2 in the morning. What she did not know was whether Ike had expected her to hear it, whether this was a miscalculation on his part, music spreading in directions that couldn't be fully predicted, or whether it was a calculation he had made and decided she would absorb. Ike was good at calculating what Tina would absorb. He had been doing it for years with a precision she had long since stopped finding surprising. She thought about asking him. She ran the conversation in the elevator, watching the floor numbers rise. She mapped the possible routes. Ike, with an explanation that made the song feel like a practical decision made in service of the act, made for their shared interests, made because the song didn't fit what the review needed at that particular moment. An explanation that would arrive at the correct temperature to make her challenge feel smaller than it had been when she raised it. That was how certain conversations ended, and she had learned to track their likely endings before beginning them. She thought about the 40 minutes she had spent on the third line, the 14 variations, the Nashville rehearsal room, the specific quality of the feeling when the right version arrived, that sense of something unsettled becoming settled, a thing clicking into its correct position. She thought about whether that feeling, and everything that preceded it, constituted a form of ownership that persisted after the song was gone.
Whether ownership was a category that applied to things made in the in-between hours of a touring life, in rooms that didn't belong to you, on instruments that weren't yours, in time that was technically owned by a schedule that had no box for this. The elevator reached the floor. She had not reached a conclusion. Ike was in the rehearsal room when she came upstairs. He was working through a chord progression with the guitarist, his back to the door. He didn't turn when she came in. The room smelled like cigarette smoke and the staleness of a space that had been occupied for hours. The guitarist nodded at her. Ike kept playing. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she said evenly, "I heard it on the radio downstairs." He finished the chord. He turned around. His expression was the one he wore when a conversation had already been resolved before it began. The composure of a man who had anticipated this arrival and prepared the room accordingly. He said, "It wasn't going to work for us." 4 words. They contained an entire architecture of decision. What belonged to the act? What could be converted into something more useful elsewhere? The difference between Tina having made something and the act having use for it. These were, in Ike's accounting, separate categories. The song had fallen into the second category. She didn't ask about the money. She didn't ask about the copyright. She understood that those questions opened roots that would cost more than the answers were worth. That confrontation had its own arithmetic, and the yield rarely exceeded the expenditure. What she said was, "I know." She crossed the room to her usual place. She put down the garment bag. She put down the cold coffee. She listened to the chord progression, and she did not show, in any visible part of herself, what the hotel lobby had cost the part of her that had spent a Tuesday night in St. Louis finding a melody in an empty room. This was a skill she had developed with considerable precision over the years. The ability to receive damage and process it entirely inside, without offering the processing to anyone in the room. Not because she was passive or without an interior life that registered what was taken, but because she had learned, through long and costly practice, that displaying what she felt was a form of offering, and there were things she was no longer willing to offer in that room, to that man. She kept the things she could not afford to give in a place where they could not be reached. The rehearsal continued for 2 hours. She sang everything that was needed. She made the adjustments Ike asked for. She did her job with the completeness she always brought to it. Nothing in her performance that afternoon suggesting anything about a lobby radio or a practice room or 14 variations of a third line that had taken 40 minutes to find. But the melody would stay with her for a long time. Not as a wound, exactly. As a fact. One of the many facts she carried about what had been taken before she had a chance to decide what to do with it. In the years after she left, when the full account of those years became public and the industry was forced to reckon with how it had handled black artists across decades, journalists asked her about the creative process during the review era. Who wrote what? Who owned what?
what rights were held and by whom.
She answered with the measured precision of a woman who had spent considerable time deciding exactly how much of her own accounting she was willing to give in any particular room.
She mentioned the song once, in passing, embedded in a longer conversation about something else. She said, "There were things I made that I never got to keep." The journalist understood it as a general statement about exploitation, the specific vulnerability of black artists in a business built on their creativity while routinely denying their ownership of it. It was all of those things.
It was also a melody found in an empty practice room, and 40 minutes spent on a third line, and a cup of coffee going cold in a hotel lobby in Memphis while she stood still in the middle of a moving day and listened to the specific shape of something she had made, rendered now in a voice that was not hers, traveling toward ears that would never know the difference. She had written every word. She had been the last one to know it was gone. If this story stayed with you, if that lobby felt like somewhere you recognized, there are more waiting here. Subscribe and stay close. There is always more to the story.